There is a peculiar quality to the moment when an enemy's intentions become visible, not through direct observation, but through the patient unraveling of the language they believed was invisible. In the spring of 1942, that moment arrived in a basement office in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and its consequences would reshape the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The question historians continue to examine is not simply whether the Americans won at Midway, it is how a force operating at a significant material disadvantage managed to position itself with such precision that a single morning's operations altered the strategic balance of the entire theater. The answer, it turns out, was less about firepower and more about information, about the slow, disciplined work of analysts who spent months inside an enemy's communication system before that enemy ever knew it was being read. This video is presented for historical and educational purposes only. To understand what happened in June 1942, it is necessary to step back to the months that preceded it, to a period when the U.S. Pacific Fleet was still recovering from the structural damage inflicted at Pearl Harbor, and when Japan's naval forces were operating across a vast arc of the Pacific with what appeared to be unchecked momentum. By early 1942, Japan had expanded its operational perimeter with remarkable speed. The capture of territories across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific had created a defensive buffer that Japanese strategists believed would prove difficult to penetrate. The next phase of their planning centered on extending that perimeter further, forcing the United States into either a costly counteroffensive or an unfavorable negotiated settlement. Within Japan's naval command, a debate was underway about where the next major operation should be directed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, advocated for an operation targeting a small but strategically significant atoll in the Central Pacific. The goal was to draw the remaining American carriers into a decisive engagement, one in which Japan's numerically superior carrier force could neutralize the U.S. Navy's ability to contest the ocean. The location selected was Midway Atoll, roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. The operation was designated MI. It was ambitious in scope, involving multiple task forces, a diversionary thrust toward the Aleutian Islands, a bombardment and invasion force, and a strike carrier group built around 4 of Japan's most capable fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Combined, these ships represented the core of Japan's offensive naval capability and carried air groups with considerable operational experience. From the Japanese perspective, the plan had a reasonable logic. American carrier strength had been reduced, and what remained was believed to be either deployed elsewhere or in no condition to mount a coordinated response. The operation was designed to move quickly, achieve local air superiority over Midway, and force a confrontation before the Americans could organize a coherent defense. What the planners did not account for was a small unit operating in a basement office at the 14th Naval District Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, a signals intelligence team known informally as Station HAPO. The unit was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a cryptanalyst with an unusual combination of skills, technical expertise in code analysis, a command of the Japanese language, and a deep familiarity with Japanese naval procedures developed over years of study. Rochefort was not a conventional officer. He was known for working irregular hours, remaining in the basement for days at a time, and approaching intelligence problems with an intensity that sometimes put him at odds with his superiors in Washington. His team had been working throughout the early months of 1942 on the Japanese naval code system designated JN-25. This was the primary operational code used by the Imperial Japanese Navy for fleet communications, and it had been partially broken before the war, though the Japanese periodically updated it, requiring analysts to reconstruct portions of the system from scratch. By April 1942, Rochefort's team had developed enough penetration into JN-25 to identify patterns in the traffic surrounding what appeared to be a significant upcoming operation. Intercepts referenced a target designated only as AF, along with logistical requests and force compositions that suggested something considerably larger than a routine patrol or raiding operation. The challenge was that AF could refer to any number of locations. The designation alone did not establish the target. Rochefort's team worked through the intelligence, cross-referencing geographic clues, supply requests, and the operational sequences implied by the traffic. Their analysis pointed toward Midway. But analysis was not confirmation. To resolve the uncertainty, an approach was proposed that has since become one of the more notable operational deceptions of the Pacific War, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, methodical way it worked. Midway's garrison was instructed to transmit a message in plain, unencrypted language reporting that its water desalination equipment had malfunctioned and that the atoll was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. The message was sent through normal channels, in a form the Japanese would likely intercept. Within days, Japanese communications reported that AF was experiencing water supply difficulties. The designation matched. The target was confirmed as Midway Atoll. This was not a piece of information that arrived through dramatic confrontation or chance. It was the product of months of methodical analysis, followed by a carefully designed verification procedure. The entire exchange lasted only a few days, but it closed a critical gap in American intelligence and gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, something he had not possessed since Pearl Harbor: reliable foreknowledge of Japanese operational intentions. Nimitz's response to this intelligence was not automatic. Acting on signals, intelligence required accepting a significant degree of institutional risk. The information could be incomplete. The Japanese could change their plans. The codebreakers could be wrong. Senior commanders at other intelligence offices in Washington were skeptical of Rochefort's conclusions and advocated for alternative threat assessments. But Nimitz, after reviewing the analysis directly, chose to act on it. His decision reflected a view that was not yet universal in the military establishment of 1942, that properly processed signals intelligence was not merely supplementary to operational planning, but could serve as its foundation. He directed his available carrier forces to deploy to positions northeast of Midway, well ahead of the Japanese approach and outside the range of their anticipated search patterns. The three carriers available to him, Enterprise, Hornet, and the heavily damaged Yorktown, would not be concentrated in a static defensive posture. They would be positioned to exploit the moment of Japanese vulnerability. The repair of Yorktown at Pearl Harbor represented one of the logistical achievements of the early Pacific War. Assessed by maintenance officers as requiring months of structural work, the carrier was rendered operationally capable in approximately 72 hours through continuous round-the-clock labor. The timeline was extraordinary, and the decision to deploy her reflected both the urgency of the intelligence window and Nimitz's understanding that three carriers would be meaningfully more effective than two. The American carriers rendezvoused at a point northeast of Midway designated Point Luck, a name that understated the degree of deliberate positioning involved. From there, task forces under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown, would operate in coordination, each positioned to strike the Japanese carrier force once located. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, air and defensive assets were being augmented. The atoll's garrison had been reinforced with additional aircraft, including patrol planes, whose primary function was long-range search. The strategic value of Midway to both sides derived from its position, close enough to Hawaii to function as an advance outpost, far enough into the Central Pacific to give its holder meaningful reconnaissance coverage of a wide arc of ocean. The Japanese operational plan unfolded broadly, as Rochefort's team had anticipated. On June 3, 1942, American patrol aircraft operating from Midway located the Japanese invasion convoy, a large surface force moving toward the atoll from the northwest. This was the support and transport element, not the strike carriers. The carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo were approaching from a different bearing, and their position would not be confirmed until the following morning. At 0552 on June 4, 1942, radar operators on Midway detected a large formation of aircraft inbound. The Japanese first wave launched from the four carriers at approximately 0430, numbered 108 aircraft. Its objective was to neutralize Midway's air defenses and prepare the atoll for occupation. The strike proceeded largely as planned. Ground facilities were damaged, though the runways remained functional, and American aircraft had been cleared from the ground in time to avoid destruction. What the strike commander concluded, upon assessing the results, was that a second attack wave would be necessary to adequately suppress Midway's defenses before the landing operation could proceed. This assessment set in motion a sequence of decisions aboard the Japanese carriers that would define the battle's outcome. Admiral Nagumo faced a specific operational dilemma. He had maintained a reserve strike force of approximately 93 aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs in anticipation of encountering American naval forces. Upon receiving the strike commander's request for a second Midway strike, he ordered those weapons switched to conventional ordnance suited for land attack. The rearming process was time-consuming and operationally complex. It required ordnance crews on crowded hangar decks to remove anti-ship weapons and replace them with land attack munitions, a procedure that could not be safely rushed. It was during this process, with aircraft in various stages of reconfiguration, that the situation changed. A scout aircraft from the cruiser Tone, whose launch had been delayed by a catapult issue that morning, reported contact with American surface forces to the northeast. The initial report was imprecise about ship types. A follow-up transmission identified what appeared to be a carrier among the formation. Nagumo's response was to suspend the rearming order, but the reversal created its own disorder. Some aircraft had been fully converted. Others were partially through the process. Ordnance, including torpedoes that had been removed and not yet restowed, was present on the hangar decks in a condition that represented a significant fire hazard. The operational cycle of the Japanese carrier force, which depended on coordinated launch and recovery sequences, had been disrupted at its most sensitive point. The Japanese were simultaneously managing the return of the first Midway strike wave, which was low on fuel and needed to land. Their fighter cover, the highly capable Zero Air Groups, had been drawn down to low altitude responding to successive American torpedo strikes launched from the carriers and from Midway. The layered air defense that would normally have covered the carrier force at altitude had been largely consumed by these engagements. It was into this specific configuration of vulnerability, hangar decks in disorder, flight operations disrupted, fighter cover concentrated at low altitude, that American dive bomber groups arrived from Enterprise and Yorktown shortly after 10:20 on the morning of June 4th. The concentration of effects in the minutes that followed was remarkable in its brevity. Dive bombers from Enterprise's Air Group, led by Commander Wade McCluskey, had conducted an extended search that took them beyond their planned fuel parameters before relocating the Japanese fleet by tracking a Japanese destroyer moving to rejoin the main formation. Dive bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived in the same general window. In a period of roughly 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, received direct bomb impacts that triggered secondary explosions among the fueled and armed aircraft crowding their hangar and flight decks. The configuration of ordnance and fuel that made those secondary explosions so severe was itself a product of the interrupted rearming sequence, a cascade of consequences that traced back to the intelligence-driven American positioning and the operational pressure applied by earlier strikes. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, remained operational and launched a counterstrike that located and damaged Yorktown, eventually contributing to her loss. American strike aircraft found Hiryu later that afternoon and left her in a condition from which she would not recover. By the morning of June 5th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been lost. The material accounting of the battle has been well documented. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, approximately 248 aircraft, and a substantial portion of its most experienced carrier aviation personnel, losses that could not be rapidly replaced given Japan's industrial and training constraints. The United States lost Yorktown, a destroyer, and approximately 147 aircraft, but the more significant asymmetry was in the operational architecture that produced the result. The Japanese had approached Midway with a plan built on an assumption of surprise. That assumption was false from the outset. American forces had been positioned with deliberate foreknowledge, not through chance patrol contacts or reactive repositioning, but through weeks of analytical work that gave operational planning a foundation it had not previously possessed. This represented something genuinely new in naval warfare, not the idea of intelligence itself, which was hardly novel, but the institutional integration of signals intelligence into operational decision-making at the fleet command level. The practice of treating cryptanalytic product as a planning input equal in weight to reconnaissance reports, order of battle assessments, and logistical analysis was not yet standard in any navy. At Midway, Nimitz made it so. The analytical team at Station Hypo did not receive public recognition during the war. Their work remained classified, and the mechanisms by which American forces had anticipated the Japanese operation were concealed from public account for decades. Rochefort himself was reassigned shortly after the battle, a consequence of bureaucratic conflict with the Naval Intelligence Directorate in Washington over questions of organizational jurisdiction, a reminder that institutional dynamics operate independently of operational outcomes. Recognition for Rochefort's contributions came posthumously. In 1986, he was awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal more than 40 years after the work that merited it. The Battle of Midway's place in the history of signals intelligence is perhaps best understood not in isolation, but as an early demonstration of a principle that would shape every subsequent major theater of the war, and indeed, military planning for decades afterward. That a force with reliable foreknowledge of an opponent's intentions can apply its available resources with an efficiency that force alone cannot provide. The Japanese combined fleet at Midway was numerically superior. Its carrier groups were experienced, its aircraft capable, its operational procedures refined through 6 months of continuous operation across the Pacific. None of that compensated for the fundamental asymmetry in situational awareness that the Americans had built and maintained through the sustained, unglamorous work of reading the enemy's mail. What Midway illustrates, viewed at this level of analysis, is not simply that intelligence matters, that observation is almost trivial. What it illustrates is how intelligence is integrated. The chain that runs from the basement of the 14th Naval District Building through Nimitz's command decisions to the deployment coordinates of 3 carrier task forces thousands of miles away. Each link in that chain held. The result was a battle that proceeded not as a contest between roughly matched forces feeling for advantage in real time, but as the execution of a prepared response to a known threat. The operational transition that followed Midway, from Japanese strategic initiative to American, was not completed in a single engagement. The campaigns in the Solomons, the grinding attrition along the island chains, the slow rebuilding of Japan's carrier aviation capability and its progressive neutralization, all continued for years. But the directional shift was real, and it was established in June 1942. The atoll around which this shift occurred is today a wildlife refuge. Its runways are no longer maintained. The physical infrastructure of the 1942 garrison has largely returned to the coral and vegetation that characterize the Pacific atolls. What remains is the documented record of a planning and analytical process that worked, that took partial information, subjected it to disciplined interpretation, acted on its conclusions under conditions of institutional uncertainty, and proved correct at the moment it mattered. For historians of military intelligence, Midway represents not a unique event, but a formative one, an early demonstration, under combat conditions, of what the systematic application of signals intelligence to operational planning could produce. The methods it validated would be refined and expanded throughout the remainder of the war. The institutional lessons it offered took longer to absorb, as institutional lessons always do. But on the morning of June 4th, 1942, 3 American carriers were waiting at coordinates derived from months of code-breaking work, positioned precisely because analysts in a basement office had read a message, designed a verification, confirmed a target, and delivered their conclusions to a commander willing to act on them. The rest followed from that alignment, not inevitably, and not without cost, but with a clarity of outcome that reflected the quality of the preparation that preceded it.